Welcome. If you would, be sure to sit where you can see the PowerPoint real well. I'll have lots of quotes and imagery that'll help to convey some of the ideas that I want to relate to you today. I work for an organization called Apologetics Press, as is on the screen, and our mission is to answer the kind of questions and challenges that are often brought up against Christianity. So obviously, I'm not going to have time to address a lot of the kind of questions that people might have, and so I highly recommend that you go to that website or email us if you have questions relating to Christianity. And hopefully I'll have time at the end for a question and answer, but if not, again, use these, write your questions down, or you can talk to me afterwards whenever we are finished with this session. So the topic of the hour, does God exist? Can we even know? Is there evidence that points to that conclusion? Well, some people would actually say, who even cares about evidence? Because faith, by definition, is separate and apart from evidence. You just have to blindly believe in God, what is known as fideism. According to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, this is reliance on faith rather than reason in pursuit of religious truth. So notice that modern dictionaries put faith in contrast to reasoning and evidence, because that's what the bulk of the religious world has come to believe about faith. But many professed Bible believers seem to not realize that biblical faith is not blind like that. It is not a blind leap, hoping that there's someone at the bottom to catch you. Biblical faith is the same as the kind of faith or trust that you have in anyone. It is based on evidence. Somebody has proven themselves to be trustworthy, and so you trust them. Evidence is always undergirding faith, and this is what the Bible presses as well. In the field of philosophy, there is a law called the law of rationality that says one should only draw those conclusions that are warranted by the evidence. In other words, you should only believe those things that you can substantiate with proof. The Bible endorses this idea as well. Examine everything carefully, or test all things, prove all things, depending upon your translation, and only hold fast to that which is good. So evidence, making sure you can substantiate what you believe, not just blindly accept what someone says to you. This is a biblical concept, and many other passages make that point. Don't believe everything you hear, but test the spirits to see whether they're of God, 1 John 4:1. You read of the Bereans in Acts 17 that are complimented for not merely believing anything that they were told with regard to religious matters, but instead they were called noble because they searched the Scriptures to make sure what they were being told was true. Jesus even told his audience to not believe him if he didn't provide evidence to substantiate his claims, John 10 and verse 37. So God doesn't want us to blindly believe that he exists. He expects us to weigh the evidence and come to the right conclusion from that evidence. In other words, to know the truth that'll set us free, John 8:32. So if God expects us to believe in him based on evidence, then we would expect that he would provide evidence for us to be able to come to that right conclusion. And in fact, God has left us evidence in many forms, and perhaps the most obvious of which is the evidence that shouts out to us from the things that he has made. Romans 1:20, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. God says we can look at the things that are made, the created order. You can engage in science and come to the conclusion that not only does God exist, but you can even learn some things about the Creator, his characteristics, just by observing the things that are made. And there's so much evidence, God says through Paul, that it is without excuse if you don't come to the conclusion that God exists. Nobody's going to be able to stand in Judgment Day and say, God, there just wasn't enough evidence. This is your fault, not mine. You're not going to be able to do that. According to Scripture, he has left an abundant amount of evidence. Well, what are some of these evidences? In studying the created order over the centuries, humans have reasoned through and articulated many excellent philosophical arguments that point to the conclusion that there has to be a God. These are arguments which still stand today as testaments to God's existence and have for hundreds of years. They haven't been refuted. And I would like to look primarily at just one of those arguments today because of time, one of the arguments that is based more on physical evidence, and that is the cosmological argument. Simply put, the universe, the cosmos exists, and it had to come from somewhere. Now, the idea here is that there has to be a reason, there has to be a cause for the universe. Cause and effect are fundamental to science. That's what science is all about, determining the effects. What will happen if I do something, if I initiate a certain cause? Now, if we want to be rational, we have to accept the evidence, and the evidence says that the law of cause and effect, or the law of causality, as it is sometimes called, it governs the universe. And paraphrasing, it basically says if you have an effect, there must logically be a cause. More precisely, it says every material effect must have an adequate antecedent or simultaneous cause. The cause must precede or come before the effect, or it could occur at the same time as the effect, and it has to have the necessary potential, the necessary power to cause the effect. All natural effects must have causes. If a baseball comes flying over the fence in your backyard, you know that something or someone caused it. It didn't start flying of its own accord. So the flight of the baseball is the effect of some cause. If you're sitting in a room and a wind-up toy comes running across the floor in front of you, you know that someone wound that toy up and sent it running. If you open up the cookie jar and you see a half-eaten cookie, that's your effect, and there are children in your house, you know probably what happened. The cookie didn't eat itself. There must be an adequate cause. If a chair is not placed in an empty room, the room will remain empty. Now, this sounds simple, but the law of causality is a major problem if you're a naturalist, if you're an atheist, because the naturalistic mindset cannot allow for an ultimate cause for everything. It just has to happen on its own naturally, but that contradicts the evidence that we find in nature. The pyramids of Giza, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the world can't come to an agreement as to how these structures were built and why. I remember the movie Stargate that postulated aliens being involved in the process. Now, scientists may not know with certainty how or why they were built, but scientists know that they couldn't have happened on their own, even though they weren't there to observe it. They are an effect that had to have an adequate cause. Nobody argues that these are just the result of a tornado coming through the desert. Stonehenge in Great Britain also, after studying these interesting rock formations, scientists have concluded that they were likely designed to allow predictions based on the stars above, but a lot of questions are still unresolved today. How was this information used, and how were the rocks transported here and set up? But one thing is clear. Again, even though they weren't there to witness the formation of Stonehenge, scientists recognized the presence of intelligent design. An adequate cause was necessary for these structures. Nobody is senseless enough to argue that these things could have happened on their own. Well, when we look at the universe, in nature, in effect, has a cause. The fact that the planets exist and that they are floating through space, they're moving, they're spinning, these are effects. The existence of life, living things, that's an effect. There must be an adequate cause. Something had to cause these things to happen, and yet the naturalist ultimately can have no explanation for this. The mere existence of the cosmos is proof of the existence of a supernatural being that caused it, and that is the cosmological argument. Okay, so how does the naturalist deal with this conundrum? What cause can the atheist point to explain the existence of the universe without a God? Now, the naturalists today will typically argue that the origin of the universe can be explained from the Big Bang, a massive explosion-like event from this extremely hot, tiny, dense sphere billions of years ago. But of course, even if that were true, it still doesn't answer this question. Where did the little ball come from? What caused it? If you're a naturalist, you've only got 2 options. Either the universe is self-created, so matter and energy spontaneously generated, or it is self-existent. It is eternal. It's always been here. Those are the only two logical options. Okay, so let's look at the first option with regard to the scientific evidence that we have available to us today. Let's say you've got an invisible box that is surrounding the universe. This is a boundary layer big enough to hold the entire universe in it. Now, if you believe that the universe could spontaneously generate, just pop into existence, create it itself within this box from nothing, in a thermodynamic sense, you believe that this box was initially completely empty. Now let's zoom inside of the box. We're inside of the box now. The spontaneous generation model would say no one put anything in there. It put itself there. And so according to this model, you can float around inside of this box and just stare into nothingness. And given enough time, all of a sudden, just pop. Something could appear. And not only could just something come into existence, but according to this version of the model, a little ball containing all of the mass and energy of the entire universe came into existence along with space itself. And then, so they say, the Big Bang process started, and eventually, given enough time, the universe expands, life comes into existence and gradually evolves over time, and finally you accidentally show up in the universe. Now that is the popular explanation of the cosmos today. But there are problems with that idea. The naturalists themselves recognize. The first law of thermodynamics can be summarized by this statement on the screen by evolutionist Willard Young. Energy can be neither created nor destroyed, but can only be converted from one form to another. This is also known as the law of conservation of matter and energy. Now, before discussing the implications of that law, let me give a little parentheses about the laws of science. According to the McGraw-Hill Dictionary of Scientific and Technical Terms, a scientific law is a regularity which applies to all members of a broad class of phenomena, not just some. There are no exceptions to a law of science by definition. And that is why the famous atheistic cosmologist Stephen Hawking said regarding these laws, what's really important is that these physical laws, as well as being unchangeable, are universal. They apply not just to the flight of the ball, but to the motion of a planet and everything else in the universe. Unlike laws made by humans, the laws of nature cannot ever be broken. That's why they're so powerful. The laws of nature are fixed. The laws of nature are understood to be unbreakable, even by the most famous of evolutionary scientists. There are no known exceptions. So keep in mind three things about scientific laws. Number one, a scientific law applies to all members of a broad class of phenomena, not just some. There are no exceptions. Number two, scientific laws describe what has been observed to occur in nature. They say nothing about supernature. Also, since these laws govern nature, the naturalist is necessarily bound by the effects and implications of these laws. Number three, a scientific law is by definition rational. It is the conclusion that has been drawn from the scientific evidence. So we keep in mind that law of rationality. One should only draw those conclusions that can be drawn from the evidence. If anything can be said to be rational and scientific, it would be the laws of science. And since the laws of science are the conclusions from the evidence, if a person holds to a scientific paradigm that is against these laws, he is being, by definition, irrational if he chooses to be a naturalist. Now, back to the first law of thermodynamics. What does this mean, practically speaking? You ever thought about what happened to a log of wood after it burned? Where did it all go? Obviously, the little pile of ash that's left there couldn't account for everything, so where did it go? Did it disappear from the universe? In other words, was it destroyed? The first law of thermodynamics says that in any process in our universe, like wood burning, matter and energy can change into other forms while it is burning. And so it might change into heat and light and ash and chemicals and so forth. But the amount of energy in the universe that was present before that wood burned is the same as the amount of energy in the universe that is present after it burned. So energy hasn't disappeared or been destroyed from the universe by burning that wood, and energy hasn't popped into existence in the process either. So using more technical terminology, the first law says that in a closed system, like a box that contains the universe, where there's no energy coming into this system or leaving the system, no one is opening the box and putting anything in there or taking it out. the amount of energy within the boundaries of that system will remain constant. And so as this chart shows, the amount of energy present before a process like wood burning or the universe coming into existence, the amount of energy present before a process must be the same as the amount of energy after it. And so if you start with nothing in the box before a process, then in order to equalize the equation and satisfy this law, you're going to have no energy or matter in the box after. So it's not complicated. It's very common sense. So if you start with nothing in the universe before the Big Bang, then you can't have anything now. Nothing pops into existence. So to most, this is common sense. This is intuitive. But the bulk of the naturalistic community is rejecting this evidence from nature and instead believes that the universe created itself. Naturalists who believe in spontaneous generation actually admit that there's no evidence for it. Atheistic particle physicist and professor Victor Stenger, University of Colorado, he's a believer in the idea of spontaneous generation. But he actually has come out and said, I must admit that there are yet no empirical or observational tests that can be used to test the idea of an accidental origin. All right, now keep in mind that part of the naturalist's definition of science includes the ability to observe and test a theory, but that can't be done with this idea. The spontaneous generation of matter and energy is a genuine blind faith. Now, true Christianity, again, is built on faith, but it is not as most people define it today. There is abundant amount of evidence to support it. The trust that we have in the Christian system is based on evidence. It's not a leap into the dark. But according to atheists themselves, there's no evidence to support the spontaneous generation of matter and energy. Now consider, if there's no scientific evidence for this, then how can this be considered scientific, much less rational? There's no way to test it. It's a leap into the dark without evidence. No wonder British evolutionary biologist and atheist of Oxford University, Richard Dawkins, in a television interview in 2012, he said, of course, it's counterintuitive that you can get something from nothing. Of course, common sense doesn't allow you to get something from nothing. That's why it's interesting. It's got to be interesting in order to give rise to the universe at all. Something pretty mysterious had to give rise to the origin of the universe. So according to Dawkins, the origin of the universe in a purely natural way is counterintuitive. It is against common sense. He calls it mysterious. Now, can I suggest to you that the word he's looking for isn't mysterious? It's unnatural. It's supernatural. Because all of the evidence we have from nature says that can't happen. That's why it's mysterious to him. So notice what famous evolutionary astronomer Robert Jastrow said. He said the creation of matter out of nothing would violate a cherished concept in science, the principle of the conservation of matter and energy, which states that matter and energy can be neither created nor destroyed. Matter can be converted into energy and vice versa, but the total amount of all matter and energy in the universe must remain unchanged forever. It is difficult to accept a theory that violates such a firmly established scientific fact. And therein lies the problem for naturalists. The self-creation of matter and energy in the Big Bang violates a firmly established scientific fact. Well, some say, what about quantum mechanics? Doesn't quantum theory indicate that something can, in fact, come from nothing? That's a relatively recent argument being made by some of the evolutionary community, but notice what Hawking said in response to that. In quantum theory, particles can be created out of energy in the form of particle and antiparticle pairs, but that just raises the question of where the energy came from. Quantum fluctuations that convert energy to matter must first start with energy, a quantum field. So notice the quantum fluctuation idea still isn't answering the ultimate question. We're not really starting with absolutely nothing in the quantum fluctuation idea. It's just shuffling the problem somewhere else. It's a sleight of hand. Now, Stephen Hawking attempts to tackle this problem by arguing that there's a zero energy balance in the universe today, and there was zero energy before the cosmic egg appeared. And so he argues that as long as there's a zero energy balance before and after, then you can have energy pop into existence. But even if he could prove that there's a zero energy balance in the entire universe today, which he can't, he still admits that there was no energy in the universe before, and now there is energy, regardless of whether or not it balances out due to its positive and negative signs. So according to the first law of thermodynamics, that energy has to be accounted for. It can be neither created nor destroyed in a natural process. Someone says, well, the existence of a multiverse could explain the origin of energy. I recently wrote a two-part article in our monthly journal, Reason and Revelation, on the question of the multiverse, where I highlight 7 fundamental problems with the multiverse, and I cite dozens of articles by secular cosmologists to prove my points. But one of the problems that I highlighted is that according to leading cosmologists, there is no evidence for a multiverse. Hawking admitted it's just still a theory. It's yet to be confirmed by any evidence. And so since it has no evidence and in fact can't be observed, then by definition it's not scientific, which is another problem I highlighted in the article. Physicist Mark Buchanan, writing in New Scientist about the multiverse, he said this in bewilderment: "Fantasy is the very word that occurs to many, including some physicists, when they hear some of the ideas popular in cosmology. Inflationary cosmologists have opened the speculative throttle so fully that physicists now talk routinely of such things as an infinitude of parallel universes or a multiverse. Is this still science? Or has inflationary cosmology veered towards something akin to religion? Some physicists wonder." By the end of the same article, Buchanan's conclusion on the matter was clear. In the end, the multiverse isn't science so much as philosophy using the language of science. So bottom line, the multiverse is not a naturalistic idea. It's supernatural. So if one wishes to be a naturalist, an atheist, then he has to explain the origin of matter and energy in a natural way, without resorting to anything outside of the natural universe. Matter and energy had to come from somewhere. It couldn't create itself. That's not going to happen according to the evidence, the first law of thermodynamics, which again has no exceptions. So by implication, it would be unscientific. It would go against the laws of science to believe that matter and energy could come into being in such a way that the first law of thermodynamics was violated. According to the first law, the only way that matter can appear inside of that box is if it was caused to appear there by something outside of the box. That's what you get from the evidence, from the scientific evidence. So according to the scientific evidence, the first option for the naturalist is off the table. Matter could not have spontaneously generated. What about the second option? Could matter have always existed? While it was once a popular idea, this idea has fallen on hard times. It's not accepted by the bulk of the cosmological community in light of cosmic observations. But this model would claim the universe has always been inside of that box. No one put it here, and it didn't pop into existence. Rather, the universe has always been. It's either been moving through space forever, expanding, or if you believe in the oscillating universe model, you'd believe the universe operates in a cycle, where you have a collapse, another big bang, and expansion. Collapse, another big bang, expansion. Like an accordion, going through that, repeating forever. So either way, this model says that matter is eternal. It has always been here. Well, Paul Davies, well-known atheist, physicist, cosmologist, astrobiologist of Arizona State University, writing in New Scientist, he said, "The celebrated second law of thermodynamics says, roughly speaking, that in any change, the universe becomes a slightly more disorderly place. The entropy goes up, the information content goes down. This natural tendency towards disintegration and chaos is evident all around us." So what are the implications of that statement? In a technical sense, the second law of thermodynamics builds on the first. And it says, although the same amount of energy is present after a process as it was before, some of that energy transforms into less usable energy along the way. And this is known as entropy. And this is an irreversible process. And so you've got a process with an energy input and you've got an energy output, and along the way you lose some of your usable energy, and this is the second law of thermodynamics. So any process in the universe that is going on, this is a universe-wide thing from everything that we can tell. So what this means, practically speaking, is that everything is wearing out. It's decaying. In fact, we can see this idea everywhere, as Paul Davies said. This is evident all around us. Wouldn't it be nicer if your car got nice? Wouldn't it be nice if your car got nicer over time? You could buy a clunker and it would just get better over time. That's not what happens, is it? Wouldn't it be nice if your room could just clean itself? It didn't tend towards chaos. And same thing with a house. Wouldn't it be nice if you didn't have to do repair on a house? It just either stayed the same or got better over time. Notice that would be a law too. But we have a law that says that's not going to happen. The only way you can counter this is to step into the system and do something to try to reverse what's going on. But in the universe as a whole, you can't do this. There can't be, if you're a naturalist, there can't be anything outside of there. So the whole universe is tending then towards chaos. So returning to our wood burning example, when wood burns, all of the energy that was present before it burned is still there, according to the first law of thermodynamics. But according to the second law, some of that energy is transformed into less usable forms of energy while it burned, like heat. And after this heat dissipates, you're essentially left with a pile of ash, which of course isn't nearly as usable. So again, just like with the first law, the second law has never been broken. By definition, it has no exceptions. One prominent engineering thermal science textbook says, to date, no experiment has been conducted that contradicts the second law, and this should be taken as sufficient proof of its validity. In other words, all the evidence backs it. So what does that mean concerning the origins question? What are the implications? It means the universe could not have always existed, and we still have usable energy. According to the second law of thermodynamics, if the universe is infinitely old, then everything should be totally broken down. We should be at a state of heat death. So to develop a model that sets the universe up to be a perpetual motion machine, which would violate the second law, and existing forever with usable energy, would be a blatant violation of the natural evidence. A person would cease to be a naturalist if he believes in this idea. Now notice all along, the biblical creation model doesn't have a problem with the evidence. In fact, it even predicts decay, a gradual loss of energy, as the second law indicates. According to the creation model, the universe will not last forever. It'll grow old and deteriorate. You, Lord, in the beginning laid the foundation of the earth. The heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They will all grow old like a garment. Like a cloak, you'll fold them, and they will be changed. But you are the same, and your years will not fail. So again, according to the evidence, the laws of science, which don't have exceptions, the spontaneous generation of matter and energy could not have happened. Matter cannot be eternal. And since those are the only two options for how atheism could happen, the evolutionary model doesn't work. So that means someone put it here, something outside of the natural universe. And on top of that, the biblical creation model is supported by both the first and second laws. So if you stick with the scientific evidence, rather than blindly accepting what naturalists claim, the evidence points to the supernatural realm. It points to a God. And that is the cosmological argument. The universe is here. It couldn't create itself. It requires a creator, an omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent being outside the bounds of the universe. Another origins problem that naturalists have is the origin of life. This would fall under one of the classical arguments as well, the teleological argument. If you've got design in the universe, there must, by implication, be a designer. If you've got a poem, there must be a poet. So according to all of the evidence that we have at our disposal, life always and exclusively comes from previous life. And we call this the law of biogenesis. It is an exceptionless principle that describes the behavior of life always, at all times. We never have life spring into existence from non-life in nature. Nobody has even been able to cause this to happen with help in a scientific laboratory. And so if there is no known natural way to get life from non-life, then how can a person still be a naturalist and believe in it? Now, as with the spontaneous generation of matter and energy, the spontaneous generation of life is not a natural phenomena. To say that that could happen would be unnatural. It would be supernatural. In the 2008 documentary Expelled, Richard Dawkins discussed the origin of life with Ben Stein. Dawkins said, nobody knows how it got started. We know the kind of event that it must have been. We know the sort of event that must have happened for the origin of life. It was the origin of the first self-replicating molecule, which incidentally, notice the problem here, for the naturalist isn't just life coming from non-life. It also has to be able to reproduce immediately or it'll die. This is a major problem. Stein responds to him, right, and how did that happen? Dawkins said, I've told you, we don't know. Stein says, so you have no idea how it started. Dawkins says, no, nor has anybody. Well, he's wrong about that. Naturalists The scientists that he's referring to, they don't know how life could have originated because there's not a shred of scientific evidence that this could have happened in a natural way. And so notice the naturalist must have, let me make sure we're clear on this. The naturalist must have a blind faith that life could come from non-life. It's not faith based on actual evidence. So if there's no proof that life can come from non-life, to believe in it is irrational and a blind faith. Now keep in mind, the creationist, of course, knows exactly how life started, and it does not violate the law of biogenesis. Now this life origin problem has long been recognized by naturalists. Years ago, evolutionist and Nobel Prize winner of Harvard, George Wald, he said this: "One has only to contemplate the magnitude of this task to concede that the spontaneous generation of a living organism is impossible. Yet here we are as a result, I believe, of spontaneous generation." Now, in other words, when you look at the actual scientific evidence, you have, if you're logical and rational, you have to concede life can't come from non-life. So if you're going to accept that, it's going to have to be a blind faith, or it's not going to be based on evidence. So this Nobel Prize winner of Harvard, he acknowledges that. It says it's impossible for this to happen, and yet here we are, and so I'm just going to believe it anyway. I'm not going to accept the supernatural option. Notice that this debate really isn't over evidence. This is over biases that can draw a person away, to ignore the evidence. This is about other things. This isn't because science has spoken on this question. Now here's the ironic thing. Even if the naturalist could find a way around the laws of nature to try to explain the universe and try to explain life in a natural way, he'd still have to answer how the laws of nature exist in the first place. Why do the laws of science even exist? Where did they come from? Who wrote them? Without a law maker, how could they even exist? Humanist Martin Gardner wrote a few years ago, "Imagine that physicists finally discover all the basic waves and their particles and all the basic laws and unite everything in one equation. We can then ask, why that equation? And why are there quantum laws? There is no escape from the super ultimate questions. Why is there something rather than nothing? And why is the something structured the way that it is? Why does the universe operate the way that it does, through these regularities that we call laws? Why not through irregularities? Why do we have these regularities that uphold the universe? What is the underlying power in direction that tells that power what to do? Why are there specific equations and specific numbers that describe how things operate in the universe? Now, equations, by definition, are not random. They indicate structure. They indicate design and intent and planning. Someone chose these numbers. It indicates a mind. Now, those kinds of words can't be used to describe random chance processes and chaos, which are the words that describe naturalistic evolution. Someone had to write the laws for the universe to follow. Now, Stephen Hawking, again, believes that quantum mechanics could create a universe from nothing before the supposed Big Bang. But again, even if the Big Bang were true, Hawking himself still had to ask the questions, did God create the quantum laws that allowed the Big Bang to occur? In a nutshell, did we need a God to set it all up so that the Big Bang could bang? Now, his stubborn answer was no, but the problem is he couldn't provide answers to those questions. He couldn't even attempt an explanation, highlighting the fact that naturalism is still a blind faith. One has to blindly hold to the idea that unnatural things can happen without a shred of evidence in support of that idea. So how could a law of nature exist without a law writer? Now, Paul Davies responded to Hawking's contention about the universe creating itself and noted that Hawking asked this very question, and then Hawking backed away from it without giving an answer, and Paul Davies called him on it. He said in response to Hawking, you need to know where those laws come from. That's where the mystery lies, the laws. The existence of the laws of science are proof that a cosmic law writer exists and that naturalistic evolution is inadequate in its attempt to harmonize with the available evidence. Notice what Paul Davies said in an article for the New York Times that was entitled, Taking Science on Faith, And he was responding to ideas like the multiverse. He said, clearly then, both religion and science are founded on faith. Now, he's talking about blind faith here. Again, not what the Bible defines this as, but as the bulk of the religious world defines as faith. He says, both religion and science are founded on faith, namely on belief in the existence of something outside the universe, like an unexplained God or an unexplained set of physical laws, maybe even a huge ensemble of unseen universes too. So according to leading cosmologists, the evidence from nature is leading them to accept the existence of supernature by faith, just as theologians have long contended, which reminds me of what famous astronomer Robert Jastrow said in his book, God and the Astronomers. For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He scaled the mountains of ignorance. He's about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he's greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. Now, he said that way back in 1978, but the more that scientists study the cosmos, the more they're realizing that it doesn't make sense to claim that it could just happen on its own. I'd like to make a suggestion as I begin to wind things down. When you look closer at the evidence, and specifically the many gaping chasms in naturalistic models, you find the acceptance of naturalism over the Bible isn't really about the evidence. Again, this is about the choice to blindly believe in no God regardless of the evidence because of other motivations, because of other factors. And here's a quote by a leading naturalist who articulated well what I'm talking about in an article several years ago for the New York Review. Richard Lewontin, atheistic evolutionary geneticist of Harvard, he said this: our willingness to accept scientific claims, he's talking about naturalism, against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories. Because we have a prior commitment. Here's what it's really about. It's not about the evidence. We have a prior commitment, a commitment to naturalism. It's not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world. In other words, it's not like the evidence is forcing me to believe there's no God. No. On the contrary, we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material just-so explanations. Notice, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. That's what this is about. The leaders acknowledge this. The leaders of the naturalistic community acknowledge this. You see it in their writings. Why do people reject the obvious conclusion from the evidence that there is a God? It's not because of the evidence. It's because they simply choose to not believe for other reasons. Many have a blind faith and don't even realize it in naturalism. There's a reason why the Bible says that the fool has said in his heart there is no God, Psalm 14:1. I don't believe that's intended to be a rude statement by God through the psalmist or a jab or an insult. It is a purely logical, rational statement. It is a conclusion from the evidence. The idea is that the evidence is so clearly in favor of the existence of God that a person would have to be a fool to deny it. Just a silly individual bent on denying the obvious, rejecting the evidence for some ulterior motive. Listen to this quote by the late Colin Patterson a few years ago. Patterson was the senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History in London at the time, considered to be one of the world's foremost experts on evolution, literally wrote the textbook on evolution. Now, in a speech to his evolutionary colleagues at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, he admitted that he had been considering anti-evolutionary ideas for several months. Notice what he said. One morning I woke up and something had happened in the night, and it struck me that I had been working on this stuff for 20 years, and there was not one thing I knew about it. That's quite a shock to learn that one can be misled so long. Either there was something wrong with me, or there's something wrong with evolutionary theory. Now, exactly. Nothing is actually known about evolutionary theory. It's based on speculation and conjecture and hope in many places in the evolutionary timeline. It's not based on evidence. There are uncrossable chasms like these that I've mentioned and several others that exist in naturalistic thinking. Belief in naturalism is a blind faith. I'd suggest to you that the evidence for God is undeniable if you fairly assess the evidence. And we've documented a lot of that evidence on our website, apologeticspress.org, and I would encourage you to take a look at that. More and more cosmologists are accepting the existence of the supernatural realm. In this article I wrote on the multiverse, I've got 2 or 3 pages devoted to showing naturalists acknowledging how perfectly fine-tuned this universe appears to be. It demands the supernatural realm. I would suggest to you that only one supernatural realm actually has evidence in support of it. The Bible has characteristics that prove it to be beyond human capability, what we call divine characteristics, supernatural characteristics that humans could not have produced.
And so I'm gonna read what was written, and if he wants to address that, I'm going to allow him to do that. Or if he just wants to say, Dr. Dave Miller wrote a book, Why People Suffer, and refer you to that, then he may. But this is the question. If there is a God, then why evil? How could God love us if evil is present? Following his answer to this question, however he chooses to do that, then we're going to proceed this way. If you have a question, raise your hand. He will call on you, recognize you. If you are able, stand and ask your question. Ask it very loudly, and then you may be seated and listen to his answer. We'll do this for as long as we are able, but I know that there are questions. I would say that we're putting him on the spot, but with his background educationally, physical science, biomechanical engineering, and his explanation of thermodynamics, which he was just touching the tip of the iceberg, but it's so fascinating, then we're not putting him on the spot at all. So we'll proceed.
Okay, yeah, so the question, if there's a God, then why evil? How could he love us if there is evil? Again, we got a lot of material on our website that deals with that. That book, what was it called? Why People Suffer. Also, the book that I highlighted there, Christian's Guide to Refuting Modern Atheism, deals with that subject as well. We even have DVDs on this subject. You can go to our website. We've got stuff in our media player on that as well. But briefly, if there's a God, why evil? Well, the question comes down to the nature of the God that we serve. So first of all, keep in mind that the material that I presented this morning shows that there is a God. So now we're just quibbling over the nature of that God. So let's keep that in mind, first of all. Now, if you've got a problem with the idea of suffering, you might have a problem with a particular God, but you're not refuting the existence of a God. But again, the Bible explains the purpose of suffering. Now, one of the attributes of this Creator is to be all-loving. And part of the idea of being all-loving is to not control everybody and make them do exactly what He wants you to do. He gives us free choice. Now, inherent in that decision to give us free choice is the possibility that people will choose to do something to other people that will cause suffering. Now, if God wants to create an environment wherein that can happen, then worked into it is the possibility of suffering. So somebody says, well, isn't suffering inherently a bad thing? I would say no. That's one of the most fundamental problems with that argument. The argument that because there's suffering, therefore a loving God can't exist, assumes that suffering is bad. All of us could think through examples of why suffering is not inherently bad. Is it a bad thing whenever I reach over to touch the hot stove that it burns me? Is that a bad thing? No. That warns me about something. Is it true that, whenever I go around the country and I see children that are out of control and spoiled, what makes a spoiled child? Well, I've seen it. I know what makes a spoiled child. It's a lack of suffering in that child's life. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about? Is it not true that suffering actually molds you into a better being? Now, according to the Bible, the purpose of this whole creation is to create what Thomas B. Warren said, a veil of soul making. This is a realm that was created to prepare us for afterlife, for us to make a decision. Where do we want to go? So worked into the created order is everything that would be necessary to do that, including helping you to grow and learn from mistakes and so forth. Well, there's got to be suffering worked into that. So keep in mind, pain and suffering doesn't inherently mean that there is no God. It's quite the contrary. If there was no pain and suffering, it would actually imply that God is not a loving God. In a sense, in fact, Paul talked about this in the New Testament. We should want suffering. We should want pain because it'll actually improve us, prepare us more for the afterlife. And so it's actually evidence of specifically the biblical God, exactly what we see in the created realm. I got another question here, trying to understand exactly what they're asking. Why, when Christians or those who claim to believe in God always use the word faith when they can't explain the whys and hows? I'm going to try to answer what I think they're asking. I think this is getting at still the idea of blind faith, which again, the Bible doesn't endorse the idea of blind faith. The Greek word for faith that is used in the New Testament is pisteuo, and it can be equally translated in English as faith, belief, or trust, any of those three. They're used interchangeably. And so it's the same as any kind of faith that we have today. So do I have faith in my parents? If my parent says, hey, son, I'm going to be there for you. Okay, well, if my parents have proven themselves to be trustworthy in the past, then I can have faith in them. I can have trust in them. It's based on evidence. Do I know with certainty until it actually occurs? No, but I have evidence that substantiates, undergirds that faith. And so the kind of trust or faith we have in anyone or anything is based on evidence, but it's not something, until you actually observe it, it's a different kind of thing than observational science, I guess you would say. So I think that answers that question. What are the kind of questions we have? Anybody? I answered everybody's questions? It's great. Makes my job so easy. No questions. Because I can just I can ask questions and answer them myself if I need to. The kind of questions people ask. I'll give you, there's one here, okay.
I've just never heard the term multiverse.
Yeah.
I've never heard that.
Well, it came out of the comic books back in like the 90s. It's just leapt into leading cosmologists. It's basically the idea that this universe is not the only one. There's an infinite number of other universes out there. And that's one of the things they try to use to explain how this universe appears so perfect for us and for life and all kinds of other things. They're trying to explain the fine-tuning issue. But again, one of the main problems is there's no evidence for it. It is a genuine blind faith. In fact, they even say there can be no evidence for it. You can never observe these other universes by definition. That's part of the main problem with this. Again, we keep coming back to what does the evidence say? We have a book with characteristics humans could not have produced. That is positive physical evidence for the existence of a particular supernatural realm. The multiverse, they got nothing. Any other questions before I ask a couple myself? There's one back here. Yes, sir.
You mentioned, if I understood you right, that dinosaurs and man coexisted.
Right.
Is there other evidence other than what is mentioned in Job of Leviathan and Behemoth?
Yes, lots of evidence. And so that book is about that thick, looking through that. So the way to approach that is if you had seen dinosaurs, if you were a human and you saw dinosaurs, but it was before the time of cameras, how would you pass that information on to other people? Well, it'd be oral stories. Do you hear oral stories of ancient dinosaur-like creatures? All over the world, yes. Would you draw pictures if you didn't have? Yeah, we've got petroglyphs. We've got dinosaur figurines where people created anatomically correct dinosaur figurines that date to hundreds and even in some cases thousands of years old before we even knew of the anatomical structures. Like, for example, some of the dermal frills, like on the spine, the stegosaur, weren't even in our literature until about the 90s, and yet we've got burial stones that go back hundreds of years that have anatomically correct dermal frills on these dinosaur-like creatures. These are the kind of things you would expect. And then again, physical evidence like finding soft tissue in dinosaur fossils. So we've got historical evidence, we've got scientific evidence. Yes, the Bible speaks of creatures that the more and more I study the dinosaurs, I go and excavate dinosaur fossils in Wyoming, and the more I study these dinosaurs, the more the depiction, for example, of Behemoth there in Job 40 lines up perfectly with a sauropod dinosaur in particular. Not just the cedar-like tail, but the actual bone structure. We've recently discovered that sauropod dinosaurs actually had solid bone instead of bone that is more spongy like typical bone is. You go back and read about Behemoth, he's described as having bones that are like beams of iron, bronze, that sort of thing. So anyway, lots of evidence of that. Now, from a creationist perspective, it gets more interesting than that, which I got a whole seminar dealing with that, so I'm not going to get into that. It's not going to be as interesting to atheists, I'm sure, but it's fun stuff.
Are there any kind of evidences of what people says that the world is a billion years old or not? According to my studies, as far as I know of the Bible, it's about 10,000 or less.
Okay, so the age of the earth is the question. Yeah, so from a biblical perspective, you can tie that down to about 6,000 to 8,000 years based on the genealogies of Genesis 5, Genesis 10 and 11. We've got articles dealing with that as well. And what we know from history, we got about 4,000 years back to Abraham. So you get a pretty good idea of it being 6,000 to 8,000 years. So the question is usually, well, what about all these dating techniques that seem to indicate that the earth is millions of years old? And the big question there is, number one, it's the assumptions upon which these techniques are based. And then the overruling assumption of all the evolutionary dating techniques is uniformitarianism. And that's the idea that whatever rates you see going on today, you assume it's always been that way throughout past. Well, the biblical model would say that there was a huge catastrophic event in the past which would have rapidly sped up all the decay rates. And so you can't make any assumption about how old something is just by looking at today's rates. But that undergirds when you look at the ice cores in Greenland and Antarctica, and they say, hey, we've got hundreds of thousands of years worth of layering here. Well, no, you're assuming uniformitarianism. When you look at the tree rings, where they say, hey, we can get a tree ring chronology going back tens of thousands of years. Again, they're assuming a ring forming every year based on uniformitarianism. We would say there could have been annual layering, especially during the post-flood ice age. There was an ice age after the flood that would have lasted a few hundred years potentially, that would have, the circumstances were perfect to create tons of ice cores in single years as well as extra tree rings. The radiometric dating techniques also have problems. Again, they're based on uniformitarianism, but other assumptions as well. They'll assume, for example, that any specimen that you're testing was originally completely composed of the parent element. What that means is, let's say you're dating a rock and it's got, maybe you're using the uranium-lead dating technique. Half of the material will decay into the other material in a set amount of time. And so they'll look at this specimen and say, well, okay, half of it is uranium, half of it's lead, and so therefore it must be that old. Well, you're assuming it was originally completely composed of the parent element. That's an assumption. We would say in the creation model, God created the whole universe with an immediate appearance of age from the beginning. So that's already a bad assumption. A second assumption, they say, is that the nuclear decay rates have been constant throughout history. So whatever decay rates you see going on today have always been the same throughout history. There's actually been a flood of recent evidence in the secular literature that refutes that. We know that the dating techniques, the decay rates have not been constant. In fact, they have been much faster in the past. And there's another assumption. They assume a closed system. So whatever you're studying has been basically sequestered off from everything else without any other material leaching into it or out of it. And again, we find that assumption being broken all the time as well. So the dating techniques that are used to try to prove an old Earth don't work. On top of that, we've got lots of dating techniques which help to give an upper limit to how old our solar system and the universe can be. We got lots of positive proofs of an actual young Earth and a young solar system. There's a book called The Young Earth that was put out by Institute for Creation Research by John Morris that I'd recommend if you're interested in studying really all of that dating technique stuff a little bit more. What do we got here? 3 minutes, okay. And there, did I see another question over here somewhere? Okay. 3 minutes. Let me highlight again for you the question, and we're starting to get this question more. Let's say there is a God. How do you know which God exists? How do you know that it's the God of the Bible and not Allah or Buddha or the flying spaghetti monster or whatever? How do you know which God exists? Yes, there is some people that say the flying spaghetti monster. And the answer is, again, we've got a book that has supernatural characteristics that gives us positive evidence specifically for the God that is discussed in Scripture. So that's one question I want to make sure is clear in any visitor's minds about that. This is not a blind faith to accept the God of the Bible. God does not want you to have a blind faith. You need to be able to substantiate what you believe with evidence. But there's plenty of evidence. There's mounds and mounds of evidence to substantiate the God of the Bible. And again, I'd recommend you go to our website to get more information about that if you're interested in a study of that. Or email me, jeff@apologeticspress.org. You can just email me directly or call us at our offices, and I'd be happy to discuss with you any questions that you might have. All right? We out of time yet, or I got another? I can ask myself another question. Okay, probably the number one question that we get is, okay, if everything has a cause, what caused God? Raise your hand if you've had that question before. Just curious. Lots of hands gone up. Okay, and that's a good question that people have. I would say in response, number one, the law of we don't say that everything has a cause. That's not actually accurate what we're saying. The law of cause and effect applies to everything that we have observed. That's the natural realm. All the laws of science don't apply to the supernatural realm necessarily. We haven't observed that. So the law of cause and effect says every material effect must have an adequate antecedent or simultaneous cause. So we're talking about the material realm, the physical realm. So that's first of all, the law of cause and effect doesn't even necessarily apply to God, but we can still think about this logically and respond to it. Let's say that it does apply to the supernatural realm as well. Okay, let's think through that. If there were ever a time in history when absolutely nothing existed, including God, and the law of cause and effect applies to the supernatural realm, if there were ever a time in history when absolutely nothing existed, then nothing would still exist because there would no longer be a cause. But something does exist, which means something had to exist forever. So the question is, what is the nature of that something that existed forever? Well, you know it's not material, it's not physical because of the second law of thermodynamics. So it has to be mind instead of matter. It has to be something not physical that has existed forever, that could be the ultimate cause, what philosophers call the uncaused cause, the unmoved mover. And so even philosophy points to the fact that there's got to be a God. And so that's, again, it's always a good question. People answer that, but the answer to the question is still going to push you back to there has to be a God. Thank you very much for your attention.